Hello everyone, today we talk about the Rashidun Caliphate and the early Islamic expansion. It's a topic we dealt with, I think, more than 1 year ago, then we drove away from it, and some people asked me to make kind of an update or kind of even a better form, because it was one of the very early videos, and we will naturally keep talking about medieval Islam. You know that by this time I've created a pretty hefty playlist about it, and this chapter, especially this video, is going to be fundamentally very concise in nature, and just to give a bit of orientation rather than else. But I think this is a very important period that is, in fact, one of the I think, most studied and discussed and debated for the relative rapidity, first of all, of the early Islamic conquests, and obviously the massive change that this brought in world history, and all that follows from it, still up to today. And the concept here is to try to look at a world about which we don't really know much, right? This is naturally, the Islamic tradition is very rich, but it is also somewhat detached from the actual events, right? Most of these sources were actually recorded orally from the time, and there was all a progressive, let's say, structuration of a properly Islamic historiography that came later, that relied on information that surely is of historical value, but is also to be considered, in fact, that underlined first of religious history and what this meant for the people at the time who wrote this, but also for the actual information that was modeled along the way through certain specific patterns. For what concerns strictly Muslim perspective, then of course there is the Christian one, but also other eras of this that came to interact with this huge domination that lasted actually a very few in its political unity, as Islam basically fragmented quite quickly, given proportionally to the rapidity of its expansion, which often happens, but also for other reasons, telling the truth, inherent to the same nature of much than actually of the local characteristics that of the same early Arab expansion outside of their peninsula, right? This is also one of the topics that is kind of overlooked. We concentrate much even on the what was the other side doing, as if it was a unique block, right? And it's obviously not, and this doesn't go just easily to the fact of, I don't know, the Near East and Egypt were at this point monophysite. They had their own political autonomistic pushes from Constantinople. It's also reflecting on what even this broad area of the Near East. So today we stop to the Rashidun Caliphs, so it's actually the very early expansion through Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, Persia, etc., but eventually went even beyond. Well, these areas were not areas like all the others. It's obvious that wasn't any previous unity to this broader region, right? There were major chunks of it, naturally, as you take the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid one, that at this point get overwhelmed in the area, and especially the Sasanian Empire completely run over by the Muslims. But we are talking about areas of the Near East, of the Middle East, that had actually developed massive civilization from previous millennia, that in this regard were seized effectively by cultures, by peoples that came from far away, right? If you look at the Romans, obviously, if you look at the lands that the Islamic conquest seized, essentially were deeply Romanized, right? And they're concretely so. This is a fair historical assessment, but at the same time, what does it mean actually to be a Roman at the time? What was really the Roman Empire about, and how much was actually locally different in terms of feelings, identity, aside from the strictly political problems, right? Because you don't open the gates to someone that, wants to seize you just because, I don't know, your state taxes you heavily. I mean, this is the simple answer to that, which also makes sense because this is also another valid historical notion. But at the same time, you should look at also what the opportunities were in this broader area that is shifted more towards the east compared to what we think was like the Roman Empire at the time. In fact, revolved at that point around essentially European or Pontic area, right? That became even more so, of course, after the loss of major chunks of the empire, including Asia Minor, by the way, for a time at the hands of the Muslims. What I'm trying to say here is that we are given for granted the fact that there had been a massive unity, like the Roman Empire, like the Persian empires could have provided, that there wasn't a real unity. Not much in terms of political concord, etc., but of actual local systems of government, right? Effectively, areas like Egypt, like Syria, had always retained a kind of character on its own. And these empires, especially in the case of the Romans, were largely decentralized in character, especially at this point, like controlling these borders. Sometimes they were entrusted even to foreign peoples and to the same Arabs at one point. We often overlook the role of the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids, not much in fact, though, as they're usually recorded, like just, the I don't want to use, characteristic, stereotypical word, but let's say they were, fighting on behalf of the, I don't know what you said first, but I mean the Lakhmids for the Sassanids and the Ghassanids for the Romans. But the fact that, for example, these peoples had come straight sometimes out of not even Central Arabia, where Islam would be born, but even south of it, right? These were migrations of peoples that effectively reshaped in part, maybe if not the ethnic geography of the area, because substantially, places like Nabatea or the Palmyrene region, were essentially kind of Semitic and close to what defined as Arab already at the time, and in this idea that fundamentally the Arab conquests came literally out of nothing, as if certain contacts, even with the Arabian Peninsula and internal dynamics, had nothing to do with that, is perhaps too simplistic. Think about the collapse of the Marib dike in Yemen, for example, and the major economical collapse that is caused in the area that had seen the development of a substantial civilization, definitely triggered movements, and these peoples, after all, had been fighting, in fact, even in the same Roman army, and we can't think easily, even I don't know how much literature or evidence there is about this, but it's possible that as there were Germans coming from all over the north of Europe fighting in the Roman army, so surely there were lots of Arabs, aside from the strictly territorialized Lakhmids and Ghassanids that had been fighting for Rome, for the Persians, right? And therefore, there were, as many other peoples, the Arabs were looking at the developments of these major powers, like these gigantic empires clashing, essentially between Constantinople and Persia, and waiting actually for an opportunity to expand in there. And when you think at the peoples that were eventually subdued, you realize that even though the Arabs did have some demographic strength, which is stressed even in certain explanations of why did these guys actually come out of Arabian part, right, aside from other regions, well, they also were a very tiny minority. Like, they didn't come as an actual structured political and social system. Like, sometimes they did migrate with their families, with the civilians, let's say, but they came to rule over areas that were populated by millions and millions of people. And then if you look at the early Islamic invasions as this fundamentally reappropriation in part of certain local regional powers, as you can consider, even within the Byzantine Empire, you can consider Egypt as such, Palestine as such, Syria as such, of a kind of a more autonomous rule. Well, this is probably not mistaken. Like, it can't be debated, but surely at that point, the Islamic invasions had a catalyzing process, at least in this. And if you look at how the Islam itself would fragment at that point, you realize that it was about it, right? There is this idea that we, I don't know, I've never actually encountered very much in the West proper, but it's as if, this was, I mean, a bit, yes, I mean, stereotypically, there was this human tide of Muslims pushing at the gates of Europe that would have overwhelmed it. That this is actually would have never happened. Like, just at the Battle of Poitiers, or there were much more important encounters even than that, chiefly Constantinople and Acropolis. That was really important. But the invasion of Europe by a major force of Islamic world is actually never happened. There have been a lot of provincial and regional scale sometimes situations in which, of course, these conquerors arrived and seized and overthrew the local rule, but they kept working essentially through the same local rule. Like, who was ruling at the time locally kept ruling at the time, essentially co-opted by the Islamic elites, right? And it's simply a demographic dynamic. It's a bit as it happened even with the Germans in certain contexts. You can't look at certain dramatically populated areas of Europe that were seized by just a few tens of thousands of people and think that those millions were essentially enslaved or ruled with iron fist by conquerors. It's unrealistic, right? So I think the Islamic invasions, first of all, could have been stopped, right, on their, like, at the very beginning. They actually risked a lot by doing that, and it was, even if it was a kind of a flexible system, because these were essentially all clans and tribes who were sticking together under this new god that, okay, let's try it, because in a pagan mindset, you essentially try a god after the other, right? And this was granting more than the others, evenly, because it was opening the Arabs the gates for, an amount of civilization that, at least in the Hijaz, from where they came from specifically, from an Islamic perspective, they're never seen, right? Because it was essentially semi-nomadic, right? There were cities, as we know, but generally speaking, these were tribesmen, right? They were pastoral peoples, and that was the right one. And then there was an establishment of Islam as we know it that came, however, later. And unfortunately, we don't know an enormous deal, in fact, about these very early moments, where we surely know there was also a big deal of pre-Islamic Arab past that remained for a long time, and that also characterized a certain part of Islam, you can say, and Islamic culture in general. And I don't remember where I was going with this, but just for considering what the overall meaning of the Islamic invasions can be. Not a major hostile force that emerged like, I don't know, the Mongol Empire. It was effectively a massively structured political and military and social system with enormous resources, dramatic technological advancements that overwhelmed every single major power found in the area. The Arabs essentially poured in, exploiting the weaknesses and mistakes of the local either the Byzantines or the Sassanids, whoever was already at that point in kind of a difficult situation, and they were lucky enough about that, right? Any person, by the way, who thinks to draw kind of a realistic and rational story from the records of the time is really not very, into it. Like this major victories that the Arabs fought, they obviously are recorded in some cases as a part of a providential path from the Islamic side, but they were also stereotyped as the first versus the latter, right? With the idea of two blocks. It wasn't like that. It wasn't really like that. And Islam was very young at the time, and before the Yarmouk, it could be just a major defeat could have easily stopped Islam, or at least confine it in certain areas, in fact, of the Arabian Peninsula, or maybe the Middle East, but not much beyond that, let's say. And instead, this thing filled, let's say, a vacuum of an area that needed a certain form of stabilization that eventually other powers had not been able to give them at the time. But, I remember now what I was saying is that the terrible Islamic tide of people pushing at the gates, well, this is actually not an historical thing. These were effectively a fairly small amount of, especially in the very first phase of troops, with a military quality that was also not particularly high, to tell it all, and that, however, when they managed to conquer this system, well, yeah, they had this overwhelming push, initially speaking, also kind of probably triggered by zeal and fate, if you want, always given that the large majority of their thinking at that time would still be pagan, or at least close to the monotheism, and this some even the Quran essentially contains, but even the Bible, I mean, angels generally speaking, and just the reminiscence of older pagan gods that were eventually revolving around the major divinity of. And this is typical of peoples that in fact have not a great deal of previous cultural cohesion, or at least that had a political separation, right? It's something in the Bible in part that needed eventually to find around the monotheism, this kind of major gluing factor, right? So it was an experiment in many ways. Of course, pre-Islamic Arabs had been exposed to forms of monotheism. There were Jews, there were in Arabia, there were Christians, there were closer, think about Mazdaism or other figures, that was this broader kind of Hellenistic and kind of also heavily Judaic influence, especially from the Western part, mindset that these peoples really were aware, but that monotheism corresponds essentially to a certain stage of development of civilization where you're able even to put on the table substantial philosophical understanding, right? And that also corresponds in part to a certain vision of politics and society. And this is in fact something that affirms itself only when the Muslims are able, and consolidates effectively only when the Muslims are able essentially to seize what the Romans had, creating proper centralized states with a permanent military, an efficient tax system, right, which is what the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphs will create. But this took time, right? What happens at the beginning is not enormously clear, and we don't have to be surprised, in fact, to see, if any, participation of the locals to this picture. And the greatest prejudice we have in this regard is that it's as if Islam kind of compacted peoples in the area. It absolutely did not. As a matter of fact, Islam definitely took advantage of this stabilized situation, but historically speaking, since millennia, more or less, there had always been kind of hegemonic powers in the region of the Near East, of the Middle East, that had represented the main center of power. What macroscopically happens with the arrival of Islam is massive political fragmentation. Like, Islam breaks into lots of pieces that nobody will ever be able to recollect after essentially the first century, etc. But it's since the beginning that this kind of even militarized essence of Islamic expansion proper. Like here, expansions are carried out also through political, cultural achievements. The Islamic conquests are largely military, are largely based on the capacity to channel sensible military certain resources towards the end of conquest, right? And this is an idea of Islam in itself, this idea of subduing, of essentially bowing in front of being subdued by God properly, that revolves in fact around even the concept of its political culture, right, which is very, very different from Christianity, for example, or Judaism for that regard, which instead split in two and contain in Nuta essentially the division between church for the Christians, and state, right? And the Muslims do not have it since this early moment, and part of the reason is that they objectively came from a tribal world that did have a military ethos in it, that had a warlike culture, right, which is different from highly and dramatically advanced states and empires that have a reputation of what is the civilian world and then was the military one. It doesn't matter that, as we often say on Schwerpunkt, of course the Roman Empire, but even the Persian Empire were based solely and exclusively and uncontrovertibly on a religious/military concept, which is the only reason for which any single political power existed at the time. But of course, the social diversification within this world was immense. These were not militarized worlds; they were highly developed, largely pacified, and pacific worlds that essentially lived of trade, of agriculture, etc. Arab pastoralism definitely added a lot to this early character of the Islamic conquests as a merely military achievement, right? These guys had spent their life forever, like in the desert, raiding caravans and essentially, carrying out this tribal warfare against each other. That was it. Like that was the only thing. Like most peoples actually did at the time, right? The more you distance yourself from this broader basins, fertile areas, like it could be the Mediterranean or Mesopotamia or India or the Yellow River in China, etc. Well, you have tribes, right? Because you don't have full sedentarization, and this means that happens because locally you don't have enough resources to survive without essentially going after someone else's resources, which means you have to butcher them along the way. So it's very important to stress this point, because it makes a lot of sense when you consider early Islamic invasions and what their meaning effectively was. And it's obvious that, however, in parallel with this, concretely military character, it's obvious that kind of more primitive and tribal societies have a dramatically low cultural resistance, for which basically the Arabs are extremely smart and dramatically opened to every single kind of culture that they encountered, right? Just like the Romans had been, just like other peoples that made an enormous success, and that in fact created a civilization in turn, right? As you know, I'm not a fan of the idea of cultural appropriation. It's utter garbage, in my opinion. Basically, every single human civilization has been capable, essentially when it's been able, of seizing other people's culture, if you want to thinking like that, because you can do that exclusively if you are smart enough to seize that and know what use to make it. The Arabs didn't arrive to destroy a civilization, but essentially to collect it and to develop it further, right? And essentially up to the 11th century, you look at the Islamic civilization, in fact, is one of the most advanced in the world. It began very, of course, it had its times. It had its time of stabilization. The true power, the true splendor, we can't say, emerges fundamentally from the 8th century, right? With the Abbasids, with this firm, with the Umayyads actually originally, but also consolidated by the Abbasids, that would become the pinnacle, in fact, of Islamic splendor, right? Under every point of view, literally, technologically, etc. But that's another story. And what I find more fascinating is instead this first part, right? And think of the problem that this represents, because every military man knows that when you conquer something, you have essentially to know how to organize it. So if you look at Muhammad, which we start from his death fundamentally today in 632. So he didn't just reveal a religion, nor he just founded a community, but he effectively created a state, right? And the state must be ruled by someone, right? And the problem, though, in Islam at this point is that Muhammad has effectively not designated his own successor, nor he had indicated the criteria with which, to essentially appoint one, to even find one, to determine who had to follow his legacy. And it's then when, in fact, in 632 it is that the problem was posed in quite a dramatic way. You can imagine the enormous competition, especially in the face of this, grandiose achievements that were at the door, essentially, that were all of this great community wanted to seize and to control under their command, right? And this is really a military thing, right? So some of Muhammad's followers managed to impose with force Abu Bakr, right? 632, that was the Prophet's father-in-law, and to whom was recognized the title of Caliph, Khalifa, which means essentially successors of God's messenger, right? Abu Bakr at this point had to commit himself, especially to consolidate the most recent conquests of Islam, but already under his successor Umar, between 634 644, there was this vigorous Muslim advance, right, in Persia, Asia Minor, and North Africa. And this is the moment in which effectively the Muslims managed to seize most, even Byzantine territories in Asia and in North Africa. The Battle of the Yarmouk is the single most important engagements. So we will talk about the single battles, right? And they're fascinating because they show you something like, many people say, well, these Byzantines, they essentially underestimated the Islamic threat here. The point is, how do you know? Like, these are very, peremptory statements. I never understand apodictic more than else, because as a matter of fact we realized that the Byzantines did take measures to stem this phenomenon, and they might have underestimated them, but how in maybe just in relative terms of what they would become, right? But it's not that they underestimated the threat simply because eventually Islam would become, right? It doesn't make sense. It's like I don't know, I can't think of fitting historical analogies, but you realize you may never know what these powers may become, and it doesn't even make sense at one point in this regard, as there were tons of other populations that the Byzantines were trying to keep under control, and were sometimes even equally dangerous at certain levels. And if you look even at there's a lot of propaganda, for example, the fact that from both sides in certain cases, but the forces that the Byzantines sent to meet the Muslims were substantially consistent and good, qualitatively apt to the task. The only problem is that that is not the only thing you need. Many people are convinced that history is like a video game where there is a stronger foe, that therefore there's someone who has to win, necessarily speaking, or that it's grandiose, that maybe there was a terribly developed enemy that just the brave and the pure in terrible numerical inferiority could defeat, right? This is utter garbage. We know that this was absolutely conventional, kind of fairly symmetrical warfare, and that maybe the Byzantines had an edge in some measure, but as we know, the empire was facing sensible problems. As far as we know about the Battle of Yarmouk, it seems more than else that the battle was lost because of poor Byzantine coordination, because of rivalries between the commanders. And to make a military history of these wars is doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of these episodes are universally unknown in terms of what actually happened, and this is unknown to anybody who actually knows what the sources are about, both from the Muslim side and the Byzantine one, right? So these things happen. I mean, it's normal that there are emerging powers that are able to crush other ones that had been hegemonic for a long time. It's perfectly normal. It all depends on the situation. It's mostly a political and social thing before the military, and this happened, We will analyze it maybe one day. And there is a lot to talk about it. Of course, we can get sensible information from this stuff, but not express definitive judgments about something that is universally unknown, right? So any kind of... I say this because, any person who has made a normal tour of the internet has found this dramatic propaganda, let's say historical, in brackets, documentaries where you find all these heroes of these or that people that emerge because they're so good and so heroic and so able, and they're the greatest commanders in history, they're doing all this stuff. Well, this is not real human history. This is, just contents created for kind of stupid people to make them feel special about belonging to groups, and the achievements of which have nothing to do with them individually speaking. But this is what all over basically the internet on average history is discussed like, or commented like at least, and that's why we don't care, right? And at least we will make a more sensible kind of analysis on other occasions. But at this point we would just tell that this thing happened, and objectively was, I'm not saying that the Muslims at this point were unable, but of course they did have their own limits, right? And that's what objectively does highlight their ability, their luck, their, even certain favorable circumstances and support sometimes of the local populations. There were Arabs at that point that had one point to choose whether to stick with the Romans. Many did, and also fought and died against the Muslims as Arabs. Others instead did join the same Muslims and went on with this to this glorious future that just think of what it means for a nomad who spent his life in the desert, just moving from oasis to oasis essentially, and raiding caravans and just selling this product in certain trades, scattered trade centers of the Hijaz. Constant political, military competition, etc., and that's their provincial scale of engagement. What it means to conquer entire regions, and some of the most advanced of the time. Here we're talking about Mesopotamia, we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about the Near East, right? These places had real civilization since millennia. And think of what it means materially speaking. In fact, in Islam, interestingly enough, there is a dimension, for example, in Christianity that there is not. There's this concept of the, that there is this sense that you shouldn't exceed, that there is a sin in consuming certain resources. For example, famously, the Sunni do not drink alcohol, the Shia do not smoke, because of the interpretation of certain verses of the Quran that say, you should not be, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing now because I don't remember, they shouldn't be intoxicated by this or that, and they haven't, the various confessions have interpreted them in different ways. But on the other hand, there is a great emphasis placed in Islam in material joy, material pleasure. Like the Christians all think that you shouldn't exceed, you should always be moderate and at the limit of poverty in some ways, because that distracts you from your spiritual life. The Muslim mindset is like, okay, God gave me money, gave me fortune, gave me food or something like that, and that's positive, that we should enjoy that. Always moderately, but still that's a positive thing, and it's praised. And this is something you find even certain, even in art, in certain, architecturally speaking, in certain, emphasis on riches and of splendor, but even culinary traditions that are also present in today's Christian Europe that were imported at the time by the Arabs, right? So, other ideas, or for example, the interest for just to make an example, for water, right? Many people say, oh well, the Arabs were skilled probably in finding water because in the desert, right, that was a precious thing. Well, it's more than else, it was all kind of Greek, Roman hydraulics that they learned actually when they seized this major libraries. Think about the one of Alexander, etc. And it's very fascinating because Islam in itself said that the Quran that does, of course, spread this totalizing message, just like the Bible, in saying, okay, well, you should, as a faithful, you should all be about your religion, etc., and reasoning, say, just through the book, right? And it was all a political propaganda revolving around this, of this political military leaders in an Islam that has always been politically unstable, right? Because there's a great distrust in Islam towards earthly rule, right? Unlike in Christianity, for example, for which every person should be kind of more fit, shouldn't kind of usurp God's rule on earth, which is effectively the one that through the Sharia should happen. Christians say, here on earth we have secular structures that must rule. Doesn't matter if they're sinful, no matter if they do bad, but they still have their share of legitimate authority. In Islam, it's very different, and therefore there was this all ostentation, let's say, of sticking kind of radically to the Quran models, at the point that they were claiming things like, every Muslim should read just the Quran, right? And maybe entering in Alexandria, there was propaganda made about the fact that all the other books were burned because all what the Muslims need is the Quran. As a matter of fact, what actually happened was completely the other way around. Like, the Muslims, as soon as they enter in this flourishing and thriving cultural Hellenistic centers like Alexandria, like Jerusalem, like Antioch, etc., the first thing they seize and treasure is books, manuscripts. They collect an enormous amount of Hellenic and Roman legacy, that they spread, by the way, basically everywhere they go, right? The greatest hero in Islamic epics is Alexander the Great, right? You find Alexander the Great known as far as Indonesia, when the first Islamic, when the first Muslims arrived there and spread this model, you find all these enormous epopee, these technological, scientific notions through Islamic tradition in Asia. We know things, for example, that in the West we did not record, or at least went lost over time. For example, about knowledge, probably about the ancient travels of Greek scientists, geographers, explorers, up to the Arctic Circle. We know about the geysers, all things that survive of the classical legacy, of the Hellenic legacy, surviving actually in the Islamic tradition, and partly lost even by the Byzantines, that are normally regarded as, in fact, the most direct continuators of that legacy, and in the West as well, right? So, and this explains part the splendor of Islamic civilization in the following centuries, because basically they managed to absorb and to put to practice an enormous amount of notions of knowledge, right? If you look at the diplomatic gifts that, were exchanged between Charlemagne and Al-Mamun, right? From Baghdad arrived things like mechanic, water, clocks, from Francia arrived horses and swords and kind of relatively rough textiles, right? That was the massive difference at that point, and this naturally is a product of the legacy, of the Hellenistic legacy that Islam basically seized, right, and preserved. This is extremely important to stress. The Muslims didn't arrive destroying; they arrived seizing and keeping very careful, because they knew what it meant, right? Another thing that must always be kept in mind in this regard is also the difference. First of all, you should always have, anytime you study history, you must study forcefully geography, otherwise you can't understand anything about history literally. And having the dimension of the massive dimension of the Islamic conquest at this point, and realizing, aside from things that can be interesting, different climates, different territories in general, the different peoples that inhabited, but also the difference that existed in terms of civilization between certain areas and others. And it's obvious that the Islamic civilization was in fact confined to those places that had always had it, right? Mesopotamia, Egypt, when they seized Spain, essentially, southern Spain was massively Romanized, one of the most dramatically Romanized regions of the world empire. And they continue basically on that track, whereas other surrounding areas, for example, the Anatolian frontier, there's always been a kind of very rough and militarized and kind of still tribal-like area where, for example, also took refuge a lot of heretic sects of Islam, and that were, quite, in fact, heterodox by definition, but they were also hired by the Caliphs as troopers because they had a quite high military quality. Same goes for Persia, that has always been a bit in between, between the sanitarization and the nomadic world, and has always had a dramatic civilization as well, for which the Abbasid Empire Abbasid Caliphate gets massively Persianized, just as the same Byzantines had received much Persian influences and vice versa, telling the truth. So always realize what was there before, and do not think that the Islamic invasions actually changed a big deal in terms of continuity with local civilization. Of course, it was a massive change, were radical transformations, but after all, there weren't many ways to rule a land at the time, and certain passages were fundamentally just forced. So essentially, it was still the same thing, continuing, evolving, in a picture that, of course, was of dramatic decline at the time, right? The same ease with which the certain regions of the empire, the Byzantine Empire, had fallen. For example, the same Sasanian Empire crumbled naturally were due to a massive systemic destabilization, due to the plague, to prolonged decades of warfare, right, and lots of other things. And I would consider very importantly in this regard that the early Muslims didn't really have even a truly oppositional mindset towards the Roman Empire itself. For example, Heraclius, that fought against the Muslims in their expansion, was greatly, respected and magnified by the same Muslims that saw in him a great ruler and a big one. And never underestimate here the presence of the universal empire. Do not think that these were the Arabs in the sense that they were something different from Rome, because Rome was kind of a national character in the Arab. There was no mindset like that at the time. Of course, they retained part of their identities, their culture. They thought themselves to be even possibly better, surely not inferior, etc. But the idea that there is a universal empire that is effectively a might, even after, in fact, the major losses that the same Muslims caused to them, it was something to be extremely careful of, right? The Muslims never thought less of the Roman Empire because it was a Christian empire, right? They enormously respected it, and they felt, in a certain sense, part of sharing that same legacy, because they rightfully understood that meant to rise to a level of power and of pride, of legitimization that could make them become in turn the universal empire, which surely, in an Islamic perspective, that was essentially what it was, right? The same Christianity did that, the early Christians being persecuted by the Romans, and effectively the Roman Empire becoming Christian. So that's naturally a very different story with a very different religion and very different political and social situations. But let's not think that certain movements are essentially, in fact, just a religious thing. That there are certain conditions for which these things happen, and there are, and these are the ones that effectively make the difference, even in shaping the culture, eventually, same religion, right? So, what happens at this point? There would be countless things to talk about, actually, in this regard, but maybe we'll do it in other videos. The important thing here is that, however, when in 661 there was this end of the Caliphs related to the Prophet, familiarly speaking, it was effectively the end of the Rashidun Caliphs, the age of 4 Caliphs, the so-called well-guided ones, right? After Umar, there was Uthman, between 644-656, then Ali between 656 and 661. So at this point, the Arabs have achieved an enormous power, and they had basically cancelled the Persian Empire and very heavily hit the Byzantine one. They dominated this immense area that stretched from Libya essentially to almost to the Indus Valley, and they had therefore started to occupy some of the most productive and stable areas of the region, and from there they began to plan further organization of their political and military power. So relatively to the reasons that had brought the Muslims to these achievements, of course this impetus brought by the idea of the Holy War, if you want, this religious fanatism and ideological cohesion had to, and surely an important role, right, in Islamic success. But at the same time, we have to realize, really from a religious point of view, the still very approximate knowledge from the side of the same Arabs of the Islamic doctrine. Right. At all times in this period, basically there were certain Arab clans that were just seeing what the hell was going on, because if this thing screwed up, the first thing they would have done was coming back to Arabia and leaving their pagan ways, etc. They truly believed in Allah, in the sense they truly believed that this was a powerful God that was leading them. It was new, right? So they were kind of they weren't completely trusting the new option, and they were testing what the situation could evolve like. Because imagine, by the way, even the degree of unpredictability in the expansion of this system, right? We think as if this were guys they had all seen it before, they had strategically all clear what was going on. Forget even about the geographical knowledge of these peoples, what could be basically non-existent, right? Or even the fact of knowing how to manage and control certain regions and being acquainted with different customs, traditions, languages, forms of administration, the need of even needing the local or aristocratic support, without which no domination could have ever been possible at this point. So even the assimilation of the Islamic precepts was incomplete this time. And much of these clashes, I think, were even related to, evidently to different interpretations of the same life of Muhammad and its precepts, and the general, possibility even to act upon them. Right? Obviously the Islamic tradition places a lot of emphasis on the orthodoxy or alleged orthodoxy, however, that the various sides, depending which perspective you want to take at that point within the same Islam, were propagated, were fighting for, essentially. But we have to imagine also that power is power in this regard, and there were certain political and military options that were forcing even a certain religious interpretation rather than another, right? And this is effectively a dramatic moment. Yeah, this is a very dramatic moment for Islam. It's a moment of victory, of great accomplishments, but also of great instability and uncertainty in many ways. So it's very likely, definitely, that the speedy Islamic advance was rendered possible and by certain standards even necessary by, as we have seen before, the overpopulation of the Arabian Peninsula, also by the good military organization that the Arabs knew how to give themselves, right? In spite of their relatively, still, I can't say strictly primitive, but at least of an unsophisticated military traditions, etc. And also, and crucially, the ability of giving themselves competent guides, right, and commanders that had actually already been fighting within the Byzantine and Persian armies, right? It was plenty of Arabs at the time, as we have seen, that had been trained by the Romans, by the Persians, who were acquainted with the military technology, with the strategy, with the tactics, and therefore put at the service of their connationals, let's say, this know-how when it came at the moment of organizing themselves. This is a big problem, right? Because you don't, as we were saying before, you don't bring a tribe that doesn't know how to run even, a larger settlement, and like a city could be, to dominate certain regional scale powers without this process of acculturation, right? And from a military point of view, even framing a tribal warrior into a rigid discipline is a great problem, is a great deal, right? Ask the Romans how much it took to them to frame this Italic warlike mindset into the cold disciplined Roman legionary. It took ages. Like the Arabs, in this sense, did a good job overall, right? It's not they developed an enormously advanced military system, but it was essentially in the average of the time, was good, was substantial, was functional, and it achieved its victories, and it was working well, even if they also managed to obtain certain results. So there is naturally also, as we have seen before, this relative lack of military resistance, met not much from the Byzantine military proper, of the Byzantine imperial army, let's say, but from the local communities, right? And which were literally exhausted after the plague, after the squeeze to the bone of taxes from Constantinople's officials. This was a real problem. Like, do not underestimate the fact that the Constantinopolitan government, for a person from Egypt or from Palestine, was the one of foreigners, right? The Palestinians, like the inhabitants of Palestine, were dramatically closer to the ones of Arabia, right, than to Europe. That is pretty obvious, right? There was something radically different in the sense that Palestine had civilization, Arabia just in Yemen in south, and that had also been declining. But overall, like if I really have to choose, and evidently these newcomers are not this extreme danger, not this extreme, these are people you can really cope with. And if they open the gate to them, and so easily, it's not much because of, it's plausibly also for the lack of a military capability. Like, we don't have to think that everybody was fine with the Arab conquest either. Like, this is to be very clearly stated. Like, nobody in general is happy of a foreigner coming to rule in your home, right? So this is the case as well. And there were definitely problems, even for the early Muslims, to keep control of these regions, right? But overall, it was easy, considering especially the time standards. And really, Byzantine fiscalism was pretty damn heavy. It had been so because of the last 20 years of continuous warfare and a situation of instability, and also of relative peripheral location. Meaning, the Sassanids at this point had managed to seize even certain these regions in a short time before. They had legitimately felt as cut off from the rest of the empire, right? Consider also that aside from the major cities that had a mostly international kind of commercial interest, that therefore had, and the elites of which kind of had some interest of remaining within the empire, but also the large part of the population that was rurally leaving, essentially, didn't actually give a damn whether they had to pay to a Byzantine official or to an Arab one, honestly, right? And it turns out actually the Arab one would also make them pay less. And at that point, rural communities are the largest, the most important in the world system there. Cities exist only because of the countryside, and that explains a lot, right? So how were really these territories organized by the Arabs when they were seized? Well, essentially were organized in provinces, not actually overlapping, continuing actually the same Roman administrative districts and systems, and they were entrusted to an emir, right? And so they had an eminently military character, especially at the beginning. There was always someone who held military control of the region, right? On behalf of the Caliph and therefore of God, through him. And in fact, these provinces were controlled by permanent armed garrisons that were in part and initially naturally of the conquerors, but eventually ever more based also on local levies that were organized. They weren't a big deal. I made a video actually in early Arab armies. If you go in medieval Islam playlist, you find that you realize that since the beginning, actually, the military of the Caliphate had to rely on the more stable bulk of, essentially, initially were ethnic Arabs, but quite soon to become foreign mercenaries, right? And the local populations just want to be left alone, or just either pay the tax. It was much easier even to just hire mercenaries in their place, but we also know of substantial mobilization of local levies in times of need, which is never a good option, but it was done, right? Especially in those regions that bordered the Byzantine Empire, that naturally were the next. There were essentially the frontier, the most active military frontier, and that in fact were largely in Anatolia, as we were saying, also as a less urbanized area, more kind of more warlike, even tribal-like. There were lots of populations in the same Byzantine Empire that, especially in the Anatolian plateau, that had remained for centuries under the Roman Empire, but they weren't enormously affected by it, and during late Roman times had even kind of rebelled and being a problem. Think about the Isaurians, these are tough grounds. Never underestimate here the terrain overall, even for the coercive means of the times. I mean, it's difficult to rule enormous territories. There are always islands, let's say, of communities that are kind of largely autonomous. They're difficult to control, especially in the hilly and mountainous areas. So for the Caliph's will, the military function, furthermore, was reserved just to the same devotees of Allah, right? So theoretically, just Muslims could bear arms. This is also an important concept because it kind of mixes the ethnical character of the early conquerors with their faith, right? So this thing obviously dilutes over time, but it tells you the original, the military original character of the newcomers, and the administration, aside from the higher offices as well as the productive activities, remain, however, in the hands of the subdued populations. There was the payment of an opposite tax that these people essentially provided to maintain for their own defense. Like, most of it was devoted to the military, and that's what they also benefited from in terms of local stability because of the deterrent posed by the armies, the garrisons, etc. And from the military conquests of Islam also rose these important centers that were initially developed as military garrisons, right? For example, think Fustat, from which Cairo would have been born, but also Kufa, Mosul, and Basra in Iraq, and then Kairouan in Tunisia, right? They all share this military origin. And naturally, after the Islamic conquests, Muslim society became more complex, right? The chieftains began to assume this kind of hegemonic role in society through, better control of their clans and clienteles, they distributed this enormous amount of riches, triggering essentially a social and economical stratification that actually contrasted with the teachings of equality that the Quran was teaching, right? Another proof that religion has a marginal role. If you have to rule a state, like, doesn't matter which religion, there are always certain necessities you have to reinforce. You have to keep someone in charge. You have to trust them with resources. You have to arm them. Same goes for the Christian Empire. It's essentially the same thing, right? And much of this religious aspects remain eminently cultural, right? And there were other factors as well that determined status differences. For example, the non-Arab converts that were entrusted to the patronage of a chieftain, hence the name of Mawali, which means essentially clients, found themselves in this situation of subalternity towards the Arab Muslims, since albeit enjoying essentially the same rights on the religious and physical point of view, they were not allowed in the army, and therefore they didn't benefit of what was initially tied to the exercise of arms. For example, the distribution of loot, 1/5 of which was owed to the state and the rest to those who fought, the assignation of lands, etc. This is very important. This is another character, actually, of the early Islamic conquests that was maintained throughout all the Islamic traditions for reasons that are kind of difficult to explain now, but essentially, Islamic conquests are militarily conceived, right? This idea of the loot is something that survives in the mindset of these people. I mean, it takes time to change it. Like all what the early Islamic tribesmen, as we have seen, were about was looting enemy tribes, enemy caravans. So this idea of seizing the loot from the enemy camps, trains, and etc. was always an enormous deal. It even was legalized in this regard. And Wu had not been part of this original elite. It was ethnic and originally conceived as such. Even when converted to Islam, as we have seen now, couldn't enjoy this privilege, right? And the reason why this thing remained is that objectively Islam was always in between, as we've seen, this kind of more tribalized areas from which lots of mercenaries always poured, like in the name of the faith, like, okay, yeah, we convert to Islam, and just we can raid at will, right? This was typical of warfare of the time, really, but as you know, there is this kind of more sanitary dimension, professional, even military organization with a bit more of stability, and there were all these mortiers and looters that surround the armies. It can be sent sometimes like swarms against an enemy province just to make damage, to sack and pillage, right? This is something that lasted for ages in many areas, especially in Anatolia. But think of all these peoples from the steppes who will arrive in Persia and eventually Mesopotamia, will convert to Islam, and essentially just for being part of the army and looting and enjoying the benefits of, naturally, in a society that was also becoming something more concrete and where they could find other opportunities of career and permanent pay as well. But this initial character of conquest, of sacking, of looting, was very firmly fixed into Islamic mindset, right, since the very beginning. For what concerns Christians and Jews, well, these were obviously not converts, and therefore they formed kind of autonomous, detached communities that, however, could preserve their religion and their social organization, right? Also, at a fiscal level, they weren't actually, required massive withdrawals. They were actually respected, and a great deal of good rule from ideal of good Muslim rule entailed actually the protection of non-Muslim communities, right? The ideal was obviously to always extend the Dar al-Islam everywhere to everybody, but obviously for political and social reasons these communities were quite precious, and as we know, before 17th century Europe, we can speak of tolerance, but not quite in the way it would become then. This was not actually tolerance. There were moments of repressions, even violent ones, persecutions, but generally speaking, these communities, and especially in the Muslim world, which was, I mean, in the Caliphate, meant as in all of its multi-ethnic character, were dramatically useful to kind of form a balance between all the various elements of society, right? So, as we've seen even in other times, there would be non-Muslim guards sometimes of the Caliphs, and this is something that happened all the way, even in Christianity. Think about Frederick of Swabia, that had Muslim bodyguards and kind of an army within the army, and help them to kind of balance the power, without mentioning that Christians and Jews were dramatically important from a cultural as well as commercial point of view, right? Especially Jewish communities were dramatically active all over the Mediterranean for trade, and they essentially connected even Europe with the major transcontinental Islamic routes, right? So, and there's always been a coexistence in in this sense, the Islamic world was much more diverse since the beginning than the Christian one. It was relatively more homogeneous, right, within. So, it was actually very complex to rule in these places, and there were systems that always tended towards instability, fragmentation, competition. So, this took a while before getting there. But let's say that all of the local policies were aimed at maintaining a balance. It was often quite precarious. So, in conclusion, also the dispute arising for the succession of Muhammad was destined to mark deeply the religious and political history of Islam. And for sure, this wasn't resolved by the designation of the Caliph Abu Bakr, so much that his three successors actually died all of violent death. And of all those factions that bloodily confronted this time, the one inspired to the figure of Ali, the last of the caliphs related, familiarly speaking, with the Prophet being his son-in-law, affirmed that essentially only the Muhammad's the descendants, in fact, could essentially access to the caliphate, right? There's often a confusion as if the Shia weren't Caliph. Actually, the Shias were the ones that truly believed more in the sense of the caliphate, in its continuity also with Muhammad. And so this is in fact what the Shiites actually emerged from, the Shia meaning the party, literally, that had to conflict with the Sunni from the Sunnah, which is instead the tradition that had a much more kind of it had an elective system fundamentally, differently from the dynastic one of the Shiites. And there were major differences, as you know. At this point we don't discuss. I made a video, for example, on the Fatimid Caliphate, so if you want to be a bit of Shiite history, that can be interesting. So once again, I discussed these things on other occasions. I won't be repeating myself now. Just know that there is a Medieval Islam playlist you can check there. And the Sunni, however, let's say, abstracting from the direct descendants, the ancestry, they entrusted the Caliph the task to reconcile, let's say, doctrine with the needs of the community, getting the consensus of the latter. This is very important. Now, there would be I should make a video actually talking about the proper differences between the two traditions of Islam, not only because it's still very relevant today, but also because sometimes they're overlooked in their actual meaning, and especially how they reflected, politically speaking, in the world. And also in this regard, how they were not just a strictly Muslim thing, but it actually came to channel and catalyze many other cultural views and philosophies. I mean, for example, just to make an example, the Sunni would be much more Aristotelian, while the Shia would be much more Neoplatonic, for example. So this is a problem that you find exactly in the same way in Christianity, and there is a lot to talk about this, even for medieval heresies, both in Christianity and Islam. It's very fascinating. Once again, playlists of medieval Christianity and other medieval Islam. I do talk about that, but we'll keep talking about this. As we know, especially the assassination of Ali in 661 and the affirmation of the Sunni aristocrat Muawiyah opened to the path to the power of the familial clan of the Umayyads that were among the most powerful of the Qurayshite aristocracy of Mecca that would have essentially governed the Caliphate up to the half of the following century, and that had already expressed at that point the Caliph Ottoman, right? And this event, especially the assassination of Ali, as you know, is a defining moment in Shia spirituality, and more this dramatic psychological trauma of Ali's assassination as a martyr, right? That revolves around all these certain ideas that are connected to Mazdaism, for example, that reconcile quite strongly, in fact, with Persian cultural background at the time. It also partly had elements in common with Christianity. Even the figure of Mary is very, very important, especially in Shia Islam, and there would be once again a lot to say here. But at this point, actually, everything could still be mixed. We know that even the Al-Mamun, Abbasid Caliph, at one point even was leaning towards Shiism. As a matter of fact, eventually, the Sunnah, let's say, triumphed, and there are two different, there's essentially two different political cultures, even aside from just religious views of the world. But there is a sort of kind of statal, more functional and elective and consensual, if you want, even sort of democratic, but it's a bit excessive in this regard, view in Sunnism, whereas Shiism is much more of a spiritual and kind of dynastic, though, and kind of exoteric view even of political power and authority. And this, however, exists in both the worlds, that also kept kind of compenetrating each other throughout all Islamic history. But at the same time, they represent two different models that fit, in fact, to different kind of political institutional structures that will present themselves. For example, about the Ismailites. Made a video on the Ashashins, those killing that were killed. It's another thing that's from the 12th and 13th century most. But there is, religion here has a role in comforting political action, and this is the important thing, because it happens literally everywhere. It's always happened, and it's very interesting to even compare, not just this various confessions. By the way, Islam is dramatically varied. Like it's dramatically non-unitary in this regard. It has an enormous diversity in it. That is very, very difficult to reconcile, because it also all passed historically through the political fragmentation of Islam itself. Whereas Christianity, that is very complex by itself as well, but it had historically a much more compact character. Like the Europeans in this regard during the Middle Ages enjoyed a much greater religious and institutional homogeneity at certain levels, which can sound strange, because we study medieval Europe mostly as the apotheosis of fragmentation and diversification. Well, look at medieval Islam, and will tell me, because it's really impressive. But at the same time, this is also a product of a situation these guys were kind of making sense of, right? And from one side, it can be seen as a weakness. This is an interpretation. It's given chiefly to, perhaps from the way eventually history has gone, like in the sense that Europe probably owes really much to Christianity in terms of its even most material achievements, like in the sense that it's a different mindset, different ideas. We don't know how and why exactly the Western model expanded in a certain form, and this had, whether it has to do with religion or not, in my opinion, it has a lot to do with that. There is a lot that also predated Christianity since ancient Greece, and even before, even from the tribal background, is dramatically overlooked, that really gave Europe a character that eventually, it took a lot of time before being fully turned into, from potential to action, but that definitely conferred a solidity that other civilizations have kind of had a great difficulty to keep pace with, right? And this is a wholly different discussion. I made a video, I think, more than 1 year ago. It was a cultural comparison, I think, between the Carolingian Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. That deals a little bit with it, because you can see the roots of this process already since Carolingian times. Carolingian times were dramatically important. Like, people underestimate a lot. I mean, in spite of the failure of the Carolingian world, there was a legacy that came from it that really changed an enormous deal in Europe. The Carolingians are really deeply overlooked, much more than other things. Far more important than the Vikings or other. They really changed the face of Europe, but very deeply, very, very deeply, and that helped further development. Paradox, but that's another. There's another video that partly fits, that is, I think, monasteries as connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe as well, that deals with ecclesiastical organization of Europe, for example, and this degree of homogeneity, right? In a time where old secular authorities were essentially failing. They didn't have an emperor for 40 years, right? Whereas Islam was facing great prosperity at the time, but definitely a much more difficult religious unity, which didn't help in that regard. So eventually lots of other things happened, so we can't generalize. Excuse me if I digress with these ideas, but they should be considered, because we still live in the wake of this dynamics, and we can't pretend as if, that it was just 1,000 years ago, and therefore who cares? No. These things happened really yesterday, and they're so close to us, and I think most of the problems we face in today's world, in terms, not strictly about, religious problems, I don't think that they're even a problem by themselves, frankly, but of many things, about our own culture, our own politics, our own societies, that stem from an improper understanding of what really the Middle Ages have been, and how influent they still are, and how much we live in their continuity, essentially. But this is completely different from whichever we're talking about today. And as we were saying at the beginning, I will keep making videos about Islamic history, because that's simply how I planned the schedule and Schwerpunkt. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.